right, so we have folks joining in now, right, Lorraine?
Yes.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of our session today. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. We hope you're doing well. My name is Sansiad Ali. I am the SVP of Strategic Partnerships and Investor Engagement at RFK Human Rights, and we are thrilled to welcome you to our final session for the summer before we take a little hiatus and come back in the fall. That would be moderated by Michael Posner, titled The S in ESG, Addressing Income Inequality as a Pathway to Economic Equity. This is a really important topic for us as a core part of the work we do within RFK Compass. And so we're delighted to have Mike, Kerry, and this great group of panelists joining us today. Just a couple of logistics items for you. You all are on mute at the moment. And once we get into the Q&A, we will open lines up. We're gonna ask that you submit your questions through the chat box. And then we will make sure that that gets to the moderator. So you'll be able to, so your questions will be able to reach the speakers. So again, submit your questions through the chat box. The team here will be moderating that, and we'll make sure that those questions get channeled through to our speakers. So with that, I'm gonna turn things over to Kerry Kennedy, the president of RFK Human Rights. We'll do a quick welcome, and then we'll kick things off. Kerry, over to you.
Thanks, Sansia, and thank you everyone for coming today. And a special thanks to Mike Posner, our board member, friend for 40 years, and for all of our panelists. You know, I don't think there's any issue that's more important today than the subject matter of this panel. And I just want to start on this note. Some of you have seen this film before, but today, as we all know, John Lewis is lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. And he was a very, very close friend of my father's, Bobby Kennedy's. They worked together on the freedom rides and in many civil rights issues. And when my dad ran for president, he asked John to come to Indiana and organize the Black community. And John did that. John organized the largest rally of Black supporters for my father on April 4th, 1968. And when Daddy arrived in Indianapolis to attend that rally, he got a call from the then mayor, Richard Lugar, a white mayor, who said to him, "You can't go to that rally. It's in the largest Black neighborhood. And there are protests across our country. We can't guarantee your safety. The police are not allowed to go there, and you shouldn't go there either." And my father called John, and John Lewis said, "Come." And my dad said to Richard Lugar, "You know, you might be scared to go, but I could go with my pregnant wife and my 10 children and sleep on the street and nothing would happen to us tonight." And he didn't say that out of bravado. He said that because he had worked so closely with John Lewis and with that community and Black communities across our country for years and years and years on the issues that were most difficult for them. And that was the night, of course, that Martin Luther King was killed. Important part of this story. That night, Indianapolis was peaceful, but communities across our country, 125 cities burned. Dover, Delaware was under martial law for the next 9 months. And the next day, white city fathers across the country said, now we owe nothing to the Black community because they've used violence. They've burned our property. And so my father wanted to counter that argument, and he went to this Cleveland City Club and he gave this speech, and we're just going to show you a 2-minute excerpt from that speech. But really what he was talking about in that speech is structural violence. structural racism. And that's really, at the end, the subject matter of today's panel. It's how we continue to have structures within our society that continue to oppress and suppress people. And that leads to the fact that in the United States, the median income for Black families is $17,000, and the median income for white families is $170,000. And that's structural racism and misogyny is why in a $70 trillion investment business, less than 2% of investments go to women and minority-owned firms. It's not because old white men are so much smarter or so much better at it than women and people of color. It's because of structural repression. That's what this speech is about. I thought it's a really good way to start this panel. And then I really look forward to hearing from our panelists. Thank you so much.
Whenever any American's life is taken unnecessarily, whether it is done in the name of the law or in defiance of the law, whenever we do this, then the whole nation is degraded. And yet it goes on and on and on in this country of ours. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of other human beings. Some accuse others of rioting and inciting riots have by their own conduct invited them. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger and schools without books. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. We learn at the last to look at our brothers as alien. For when you teach a man to hate and to fear his brother, when you teach that he is a lesser man because of his color, then you also learn to confront others, not as fellow citizens, but as enemies. To be met not with cooperation, but with conquest, to be subjugated and to be mastered. We learn to share only a common fear, only a common impulse, to meet disagreement with force. But this much is clear: violence breeds violence, repression breeds retaliation, and only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. We must admit the vanity of our false distinctions and learn to find our own advancement in search for the advancement of all.
Thank you, and please welcome Mike Posner.
Thank you, Carrie and Sansia and everybody at RFK and Compass. I'm really proud to be on the board and having worked with Carrie and RFK Human Rights for so many years. And as Carrie said, this is really today's discussion about addressing income inequality as a pathway to economic equity. Cuts to the core of some of the things that Robert Kennedy was talking about in that speech. We have three great panelists, and I want to introduce them first. I'm going to then say a couple of words by way of introduction to the subject, and then we're going to do this as a question and answer session, hopefully with a fair amount of back and forth among the speakers, but also I really want to encourage people who are on this call to pipe in, ask questions. We want to mix it up and make it as much of a conversation as possible. We're really lucky to have with us David Weil, who's the Dean and Professor at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. He's been there since 2017, and before that spent 3 years in the Obama administration as the administrator, which is the director of the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. He's really a recognized expert on employment, labor market policy, author of 5 books, many articles. One of his books is called The Fissured Workplace, and we're going to get into that a little bit. It sets the context for what we're talking about here today. Essma Bengabsia is a senior associate for sustainable and impact investing at Glenmede. Glenmede has about $40 billion of assets under management. They started in the 1950s as the vehicle to manage the Pew family funds, the Pew Charitable Trust. They now represent about 2,000 families. She's the author of a recent report called Racial Equity Investing, Opportunities for Impact and Alpha. And we're going to talk about that as well. And finally, my terrific colleague, Casey O'Connor-Willis, is a senior program manager at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights, which is a center I lead. I'm also the Kohlberg Professor of Ethics and Finance at NYU Stern. Casey has been with us for the last 4 years. She's really at the center of helping us develop indicators for human rights, leadership for investors, author of a 2017 report we did called Putting the S in ESG. I'm going to talk with her also about her efforts now to make income inequality the centerpiece of the discussion about S in ESG investing metrics. I'm going to take just 2 minutes to set the context for this discussion and then turn to our panel. There's an expression, a saying that out of adversity comes opportunity. If that's the case, we have unbelievable opportunities in front of us right now because the adversity is aplenty. And we're going to try to unpack 3 aspects of what the adversity is, one of which I would call chronic and growing inequality across our society and in fact across the world. Income inequality is not lessening, it's growing. I looked up some numbers. In the 1800s, the ratio of income between the top 20 and bottom 20% was about 3 to 1. By the 1990s, it was 86 to 1. We have statistics that the 400 richest Americans are wealthier than the bottom half of our whole society. The richest 1% have more wealth than the bottom 90%. And globally, the 22 richest men in the world have more wealth than all of the women in Africa. So we're living in a world where there is massive inequality. It's not getting better, it's getting more pronounced. Second adversity is COVID. And Carrie and John Rogers did a terrific piece in MarketWatch several weeks ago. There are 40 million Americans out of work. A majority of those are people of color. We see in the global economy, global manufacturers, buyers, stiffing their suppliers, not paying them for work already done. We're seeing that in Bangladesh and countries around the world in low-wage industries. And we have this odd juxtaposition of stock prices doing just fine, while unemployment rate's 11% and people at the bottom are trying to figure out where their next meal is coming from or how to pay the rent. And so the second set of adversity is COVID. And then third, finally, is the chronic situation, the disproportionate effects that all of this has on minority communities, people of color, African Americans in particular. As Carrie said, there's a 10 to 1 ratio of the net worth of white families and Black families in America. It's true in every indicator. 44% of African Americans own their own home. It's 75% for white families. 42% have stock. It's 65% for whites. And it's actually, again, growing worse. St. Louis Fed did a study looking at college-educated whites between 1992 and 2016. Their wealth went up 96%, where college-educated Blacks fell by 10%. So we are dealing in a world where there's inequality baked into the system, made worse and amplified by COVID. And when we look in particular at communities of color, African Americans in particular, we have a chronic but urgent need to take these issues on. That's our agenda. It's a big agenda. We've got about 45 minutes to solve all of this. So I want to get to it, but I want to give a spoiler alert. There are a lot of LPs in this audience on the phone. And so if you're running or you're working at CalPERS or CalSTRS or public pension funds, this is also about you. And one of the things we want to do is not only analyze the problem, but look at some of the ways to address it. And a lot of it has to do with active choices about who's managing money, who's in the management of those firms themselves. And so we're going to get into the discussion pretty quickly about where we go from here and how we begin to address these problems. So let's get started. Casey, I want to talk, first of all, I want you to say a little bit about the ESG index world. You spent a year or more studying about a dozen indexes of ESG, and in particular, how they're dealing with the S. Give us a little flavor of what you found in your study and the report you did in 2017.
Sure. So in 2017, we looked at just 12 of the most kind of popular ESG ratings, rankings, sustainability reporting guidelines. We looked at just the social measures, and from just those 12 frameworks, we had over 1,700 social measures to examine. So the first finding of our research was just how voluminous this measurement universe really is. And those measures were, they were all over the place in terms of the subjects that they covered. But perhaps one of our most significant findings was that 98% or 92%, sorry, of the measures that we looked at were really evaluating the robustness of policies and governance structures and commitments that had been made by these companies. And there were only 8% of the measures that were attempting to evaluate the efficacy of those in terms of achieving better outcomes or impacts on the ground. In addition, there were very, very few indicators that were trying to evaluate the efficacy of these governance structures in shaping or influencing the way that business gets done day to day. And so these kind of twin findings that we have been overly focused on policy and really not on the core dimensions of the business, I think are the main lessons for our conversation today as we think about the S and ESG and the kind of data that we might need moving forward to bring it up to the E&G standards.
And so taking those findings, Casey, you've begun in the last year to look at economic or income inequality as a defining feature of S. How did you come to that, and what's the implication of that?
Well, as I said just now, the S was really ill-defined and it was very idiosyncratic. It was a category that meant something different to everyone that approached it. And that is contrasted with the environmental category, where climate change had served as a really galvanizing issue in that context. And I think that the diversity of issues covered in S really reflect that there at that point hadn't been a really widely viewed problem that felt as urgent as climate change. And that's what I think we've seen change in recent months, in particular, with inequality and income inequality in particular really coming to the fore as the sort of central social issue of our time.
David, I want to bring you in. You've been studying, as an economist, you've been studying the trends of inequality, and maybe as a starting point, you could say something about how things have shifted in the post-war period and the relative progress or lack of progress across income categories. You've done a lot of research on that.
Thanks for having me, Michael, and thanks to the RFK Human Rights for inviting me. You know, you stated a lot of the statistics about what's changed. I would add one more that says something pretty profound did change from the period of the post-war era to really beginning in the 1980s to the present. Raj Chetty and his team of colleagues have done these amazing studies looking at changes in economic mobility. And one of the most stark findings they have from their work is that if you were born in 1940, you had about a 90% chance of doing better than your parents did. Sort of the classic statement of upward mobility. And looking at that cohort, that's what they found. If you were born in 1980, just 40 years later, one generation later, your chance of doing better than your parents did decreased to about a 50-50 coin toss. So from 90% to 50%. And that to me is really symptomatic of a change in the structure of our business, the way that businesses are organized in our country. That was one of the, and we can talk more about this, one of the, I think, underlying causes of this. In the post-war period, the whole system we had built of employment, and whether we're talking about how people's wages, job protections were assigned, the kinds of benefits they got from work, and even the structure of their wages were very much built on a system of employment defined by the four walls of a company. And what really started to change in the latter part of the 70s and then amplified throughout the next decades was a breaking apart of that relationship. And in particular, pressured by both private and public capital markets, more and more companies were asked to look at their, what was called in business speak, core competence, make sure that's what their central business plans were all about, and then went about the business of shedding anything that wasn't directly related to that. So that began with spinning off conglomerate enterprises in the early 80s, late 70s, but then basically debundling a lot of activities from the core operations of businesses, major businesses in the country. And over time, as in part because information technologies and other kinds of innovations allowed businesses to, in a way, have their cake and eat it too, you could shed the activities, but still actually exert major control over them. More and more companies went to a model of outsourcing through subcontracting, through franchising, third-party management, lots of different devices that broke apart the employment relationship and broke apart in a way the responsibility of those lead companies to the whole set of people who surrounded them and provided the value that ultimately showed up in stock prices. And as capital markets continued to move, the more people did this, the more the impetus was for this, what I call fissuring of the workplace. And the result of that really expresses itself in a lot of ways, from the erosion of workplace standards, the erosion of protections, and more risk being shifted onto the workforce, and particularly the workforce of color and women and people in the most vulnerable positions. And it changed our whole wage structure as an economy, so that if you look in the post-war period, growth in GDP and per capita GDP tracked growth in real earnings. Somewhere around 1980, that broke apart. So you had continued growth in the overall value produced by the economy, but less and less went to the workforce. And really that's a result of this really fundamental change that has continued even and has been really exposed by the COVID crisis and the economic downturn that's accompanied it.
David, I want to ask you and Casey both a question that comes from Harry Kelly, who is at CalSTRS. I piqued his interest by mentioning them. He said, how do institutional investors like us at CalSTRS hold our investor partners accountable with clear metrics on S as an investor risk? He goes on to ask, what are the key questions we as fiduciaries should be asking so that our partners understand we see the income racial equality as an investor risk we take seriously. Let's get into it. David, you want to respond in case of?
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest questions that I think investors should be asking is, how are you getting the returns you're getting, and particularly the role of outsourcing? And let me give you a tangible example. When I served in the government, the Wage and Hour Division enforces all of our baseline labor standards in the country. And we had many industries where we found what had in the past been done in-house had been outsourced in one way or another. And people who had done those outsourcing decisions would be asked, well, did you used to pay these people to do it directly? Yes, the answer is yes. How much are you paying now to do that work? And often they would report numbers. The price being paid to a subcontracted enterprise would be one where it would be laughable to believe that that subcontracted entity would be able to pay the wages, even the minimum wages required by the federal government. And the answer would often be, well, we didn't know. We're just paying now a price for service. We're not paying wages, even though that same enterprise had actually been responsible for those wages maybe 1 year before, and probably knew pretty well there's something that is now out of line, or someone is not being compensated. I think the fundamental question, certainly surrounding outsourcing practices, is this a sustainable model ultimately for the people who are in fact doing the work? Can we just really rid ourselves of the responsibility because we're saying we're paying a price now for a service rather than a wage for an activity, where very often those are still the same thing? So I would say questions deriving around deeper questions about what's being shifted out and what are the consequences of that for the workforce of those decisions.
Casey, do you want to jump in? I imagine that our friends at CalSTRS are saying, boy, you're asking us to do what? Mm-hmm. We're trying to maximize the return for our pensioners. We want to make sure that we're, following our fiduciary duty, and you're now telling me we've got to go tell them to stop outsourcing?
Well, one of the challenges that emerged from that early research around social measures is and that is well known in this space, is the poor quality of data that's available on some of these social factors. And I think this is especially acute when it comes to these broader questions of the workforce and how to evaluate these outsourcing challenges that David raised. When I looked at those initial social measures, focusing in on those that were targeting labor, there are reasonably high quality metrics when it comes to that directly employed workforce. But there is a real cliff once you move into these other workers that are critical to the value of the company, whether they be independent contractors, which are almost entirely absent from the measures, or certainly the outcomes and conditions of workers in these that are working under these third-party vendors, and in these, whether they be global supply chains or domestic vendor relationships. So one of the big things that we're working on, and that I think would merit greater attention by the broader investment community around these issues, is how do we start to get better measures and better information available that really accounts for that broader workforce. And so you can start to evaluate the extent to which a company or an industry has been transformed by outsourcing, or by automation is another dimension that we're looking at, in ways that create new risks that need to be managed. And then what are the kinds of questions that you need to introduce into your engagement strategies that help to assess how well a company is managing those new novel challenges that have come with this restructuring.
So Casey,
the good news from an investor perspective is that these transformations our legal and regulatory systems certainly have not caught up to them, and so there are risks also from an operational perspective that are introduced by this increasingly complex structure. And so I think from an investment perspective there is the potential here to use this lens to identify companies that are perhaps overly reliant on these near-term cost-cutting strategies that aren't going to be sustainable in the long run, again, kind of akin to climate change, from those that are investing in some of the fundamentals that are going to deliver that more stable, more sustainable value over time.
Can I just pick up and illustrate, I think, what Casey just described in something that has been a major source of investment, and that's a big part of the tech industry. And again, I became aware of this both from prior work I was doing as an academic, but it became sort of a laser focus when I was in the government. And I was there during the time of the platform business model exploding, particularly everyone wanting to recreate the Uber and Lyft startup bonanza. And that system, that platform system, is just a modern form of what I've described as fissuring again, where you have the platform is doing everything to coordinate all the activities of the workforce. It's doing it through algorithms, it's doing it through not direct management control, but it is a management system. And what you have at the bottom of that system are people working as independent contractors who are unprotected by labor law, who are not being paid a wage, but in fact they are being paid as if they are an employee. And if you do an analysis, and there are various analyses that have been done about whether it's Uber employees or Amazon Flex drivers, about their true average earnings, they are often well below even the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. The problem is those business models for a long time, particularly fueled by venture capital at those startup phases, were premised on adopting this kind of model. So investors were being attracted to business models where really the entry condition was, we will treat the workforce as independent contractors. And that led to a mushrooming of this kind of business practice, really through the infusion of capital into those kinds of vehicles, with huge consequences on inequality in the workforce. And again, predominantly, those workforces are often are disproportionately Black, people of color, who are really bearing the risks and the costs of those models.
Great.
Just
So,
one last follow-up point on that. I would just add that also that the attractiveness of that Uber model has led somewhat predictably to now many more discussions and experiments with a regulatory response. That again, it would behoove investors to identify some of those risks, before they find themselves invested in companies that aren't going to continue to be able to advance the model that they began with.
Essma, I want to bring you in to answer the question from a racial equity aspect as well.
Mike, and thank you to the hosts of this panel. Much needed discussion, especially now. In terms of the racial equity aspect, I think the question was posed by CalSTRS. When we think about a lot of the barriers and inequities that Casey and David have touching on, and we think about some of the stats that were presented earlier in this conversation around the racial wealth gap, the racial home ownership gap, so on. So many of these gaps are a result of barriers that are in place due to systemic inequities and systemic racism. So the racial wealth gap did not just happen. When we think about historic policies in the U.S., such as segregation, Jim Crow laws, slavery, and so on, those planted the seeds for Black families and communities of color broadly to not have access to high-paying jobs in the job market generations before us. And so those families did not have wealth to build out, that they were not able to pass wealth down generations. And so many of the gaps that we're seeing today are the results of very intentional policies, many of which we're seeing still alive in some way, shape, or form today. And what do I mean by that? There are a few studies and various or numerous actually data points and research that illustrate this, but I'll kind of just pick out a few. There was a study on the loan denial rates of applicants of color versus white applicants when they just apply to a loan at a bank, whether it's for a home mortgage, whether it's for, you know, a small business that they own, whatever it is. And studies show that the loan denial rates of applicants of color are 3 times the denial rates of white-owned applicants and white-owned firms. And so when we think about the barrier to capital that people of color face and that businesses that are owned by people of color face, those are the ramifications of not being able to access capital means that the small business owner, you know, isn't able to get that loan to grow out their operations, to grow out their wealth, and so on. Significant, or specifically with home mortgages, people of color are also face significantly higher denial rates. In Philadelphia specifically, African American applicants face denial rates that are 2.7 times the denial rates of white applicants. And again, this is holding constant for, you know, creditworthiness and all other credentials of an applicant. And there are tons. I mean, we've heard studies about, you know, if you put a resume that's quote unquote whitened and a resume where the person's name sounds more, you know, ethnic or non-white, the resume of the white applicant will get double the callback rates for interviews than the applicant whose identity is evidently, you know, diverse or non-white on their resume. And so the reason I bring all of these up is because, as you know, the Calvers and the Calsters and the different investors of the world, if we want to address the results and the home ownership gap and the wealth gap and all these other inequities, we need to get to the roots. And so what you as institutional investors with lots of power in your shareholder engagement can do is you can engage with companies around, you know, just the basics. What is the diversity of their workforce? What does the racial diversity look like? Is it that, you know, they might say 40% of their workforce is people of color, but all the people of color are in, you know, the administrative staff, back-end janitorial jobs, and then all of the revenue generating teams are non-diverse? Do those inequities exist in that company? Because, you know, if those inequities exist in that company, and then we're taking those companies and putting them at scale and looking at US society at a macro level, that's how we get to where we are. So it's parsing out this data and looking at, you know, what are the retention rates of people of color in their company? Is there a pipeline for people of color to climb up the ladder within that company and to see, you know, pay increases and to see salary increases over the long term? Other things within, you know, the financial sector, specifically in the banking sector, how are we engaging with companies that we invest in around any discriminatory policies around lending and around financial inclusion? In terms of the report that I published a few weeks ago in conjunction with a number of other organizations and advisors, we actually list very specific guiding questions that investment firms and investors can use that can really guide this thinking process, because I think it's really important for us to look at what role is the private sector playing and what role are companies playing in exacerbating these inequities at a macro level. And I think this ties very much into what Casey and David have been talking about, because when we talk about vulnerable workers and vulnerable communities, communities of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID, disproportionately you know, occupy lower wage jobs because of these inequities that they face in the job market, you know, in the capital market, to access the tools needed so that they can actually build out their wealth and climb up the socioeconomic ladder.
Essma, I want to follow up on what you're saying and take it to the next level. One of the premises of your really interesting report called Racial Equity Investing, Opportunity for Impact and Alpha, is that there is a financial case to be made that greater diversity in the workplace and even at the executive level yields a better economic outcome. Can you elaborate on that? What's the basis for that? Again, I'm imagining people on this call are thinking, all right, this all sounds good, but how do we make the case to our superiors? How do we make the case that we're not drifting off into a kind of do-good moment where we're not paying attention to the basics?
Absolutely. The examples I can share are plentiful. So I'll just share a few and then point everyone to the research for anyone who's interested in learning more. But I'll kind of start off with a really relevant example in terms of risks. When we make investments in companies that exacerbate racial inequities and exacerbate so many of the inequities that we're discussing today, what kind of risk does that mean in a portfolio, in a retirement portfolio, for example, or whoever you're managing capital on behalf of? So lots of racial equity investors advocate against investing in the private prison industry and in the private immigration detention industry for, evident reasons around human rights violations and the fact that the business model builds itself around the captivity of people. And when we look at the headline risk and the risk that comes with those investments, following the administration's caging of migrant children along the US-Mexican border a few years ago, when this got a ton of media coverage, and we saw protests around the country and lots of protests along the US-Mexican border, we also saw lots of public attention turning to who are the owners of these private prisons and private immigration detention centers, and in effect also who's investing and who's financing these firms. And so we saw lots of protests around JP Morgan and several investment firms and banks. Grassroots organizers were coming together and protesting and demanding that these firms divest from these companies. And then in 2019, we saw a wave of about 12 banks announce that they are no longer going to provide loan financing to private prisons. These banks include JP Morgan, PNC, and a number of others. And these banks collectively held about $2.4 billion, or 87.4% of the credit lines and term loans of the two largest private prison companies in the US, CoreCivic and GEO Group. Now, the reason this is important is because when we talk about social and governance risks generally, we talk about how these risks within a portfolio, they are kind of contrary to the argument for enhancing risk mitigation in a portfolio and thinking about how do I not take on excessive risk? How do I not take on, volatility? How do I not invest in entities that might have, headline risk, political risk, and so on? On the flip side, investing in private prisons and immigration detention centers very much hold those risks, and we saw those risks play out last year. And in our research, when we spoke to a few investment firms who had divested from this space, several years ago, even before they saw this wave of divestments on the credit side in 2019, they said, yeah, we saw it coming. We would have never invested in this anyway. The risks simply, or the returns do not justify the risk that we would have taken on. That's kind of from the risk mitigation standpoint. From the return enhancement standpoint, McKinsey released 2 studies over the past 5 years that shows that investing in companies that are racially diverse, that include racial diversity in senior leadership roles, and so they have executive teams where diverse perspectives are being accounted for, and diverse perspectives have decision-making power, those companies are 43% more likely to outperform their national industry medians. Now, importantly, we're not saying that correlation is the same thing as causation, and we don't have studies to point to yet that illustrate causation. However, the numbers still are undeniable. The fact that there's such strong correlation between more racially diverse companies within their leadership specifically and stronger performance. And I mean, there are tons more examples, but I think those 2 case studies really illustrate there is a strong argument for racial equity investment and having a racial lens in one's investment decision-making process. On the flip side, you don't lose out. I mean, it's not like by making an investment in a racially diverse company, you're sacrificing returns. So why not include that lens in your decision-making process?
All right, thanks, Essma. Your report has now been posted for everybody in attendance in the chat piece here, and we will make sure that everybody gets it. It would also be useful if you would give Compass the links to the 2 McKinsey studies so that people have access to that. I want to come back to Casey and David. George Vredenberg, our good friend, has asked a couple of questions that are sort of linked, and I want to get your reactions to this. The first is, are there models of national economic health where there are lower levels of income, wealth, or racial inequality? And is that, better or worse, in terms of, performance? And then he says in a different way, beyond individual company performance, what's the evidence regarding the change in national economic health or performance were we to reduce inequalities of income, wealth, and race? So he's really asking the broader question about can we draw some links here economically? Maybe David, start with you, and then Casey, jump in on this.
Well, I think, often the Scandinavian countries are invoked as models of, over the long-term exemplary economic performance. And although almost all industrial countries have experienced growth and inequality, as you remarked, Michael, in your opening remarks, the level of inequality growth has been much more modest. We know from the work of a number of economists, Nobel-winning economists whose name just jumped out of my head, about the link between inequality and health outcomes of nations, that countries that have less inequality also do better in terms of a lot of basic measures of health, whether it's the longevity of life, infant mortality. A lot of the measures about the quality of life move in the same direction as greater equality, lesser inequality. And I think one of the things that marks those countries that have set stronger boundaries around what are the responsibilities of the people who get the gains from value creation through work, are stronger methods of really linking or lowering the risk space by the workforce from those people who are producing the value and creating the value. And I think we have a lot of different countries, different models. And again, Europe has moved away from levels of control they had in their labor market in the 1980s, and yet they have not in any way come close to what has happened in this country, where we have lost a lot of the protections, a lot of the things that used to bound behaviors, and would allow greater sharing of the benefits created by economic growth. So I would cite both that link of economic growth to the overall welfare and health of the economy, and then making a more careful balance between protections and growth outcomes.
Casey, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, there are a couple of additional examples that I think regularly make the rounds. I mean, one is certainly the co-determination model in Germany around how you integrate some of these worker perspectives and concerns into these high-level business strategies that are reshaping the nature of the employment relationship, the structure of the workforce, and all of that. And then I think Denmark also offers another interesting example, specifically from the Scandinavian companies, in terms of taking an approach where they essentially try to better manage not the disruption of the workforce. So there's less of a desire to try to keep employees in their current positions and more of an effort on how do you help with the transition to another position. And so both of those, I think, offer some wisdom from an investment perspective about how do you engage with a company. You don't have to be, putting workers on boards, and you don't have to, be living in a country where, you have these sort of active labor policies to support transition, but you can be similarly asking those questions. How are you thinking about the implications of some of these high-level cost-cutting strategies for workers and building that into those high-level board decisions? And similarly, when you are making when you are adopting strategies that are going to be highly disruptive on your direct workforce, how are you thinking about helping with that transition in a way, again, that strikes a better balance between the gains of outsourcing and automation, which are good for our economy, certainly, and the potential downsides of those when they're not adequately managed.
Yeah, interestingly, I want to put kind of a few numbers on what David and Casey are saying around the racial wealth gap and closing that specifically. The Kellogg Foundation released a report that said that by closing the racial earnings gap in the United States, we would generate an additional $2.7 trillion in GDP today, and an additional $8 trillion in GDP by 2050. And the reason this is a really important consideration for us to think about at the macroeconomic level is because when we have a significant portion of our population who are not able to access, quality education, access quality jobs, be productive, fruitful members of society, not because they're not trying, but because they simply cannot access the tools and the opportunities they need to thrive and prosper, that holds back the economy at a larger scale. and thinking about the demographics and how that plays into this, people of color in the United States are projected to be over half of the overall US population by 2042, and over half of the working age population specifically by 2032. And these are projections released by the US Census Bureau. And so thinking about how all the barriers in place hold back people of color, and thinking about the increasing portion of people of color in the US, and then the economic effects for the United States economy overall, this is something that is top of mind, not only for, for activists who might care about racial justice, or even for investors who might be looking at how do we enhance our investment decision making by accounting for racial equity, but also for economists at large, and anyone who's really looking to grow out the US economy and keep the economy in a competitive place over decades to come.
There are a couple questions on the table, and I want to get to them quickly before we close out. Mary Morris asks, would companies publicly disclosing EEO1 data that they already have to report be useful to investors as well as company boards to understand the structural diversity issue of employees? David?
Yeah,
Well,
the easy answer to that is 100%.
Okay, we got 2 yeses.
Well, no, I have a strong caveat. It's the problem of that data is what it masks are the, again, different forms of outsourcing that often lead to occupationally segregated businesses where you might have a very high proportion of women or people of color working on detached from the company, and those jobs often having very low wages, no benefits, all kinds of issues, I think. And importantly, to one of the points Essma was making, those jobs no longer create a portal into these higher wage jobs. They are separate businesses detached from companies. And so the idea of working your way up in the old model from the mailroom simply doesn't work if that mailroom has been outsourced to a company that's providing dead-end jobs. So there are limitations to understanding who your workforce is and who is left out.
Last question from, I guess this is Angus Deaton or Paul Rissman. The whole idea of outsourcing movement was to improve returns on assets, returns on capital. Investors, he says, will not be willing to relax those constraints. You can point to reputational legal risks to particular companies like Boohoo, but if investors are well diversified, they won't care. How do we get out of this mess, he says, short of policy prescriptions? I guess the real question is, does the government need to intercede? Can we assume, is there some way for the investment community on its own volition begin to think differently about these issues? David, do you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I think from my perspective, government intervention is going to be critical. It's not the only thing, but it sets, as it always has, sets boundaries. The degree of income inequality that you started our talk about, our discussion about, and even more amplified by racial inequality, has gone to extents that we haven't seen in this country since the 20s. That to me says, and again, the COVID has exposed this so much in so many ways, the need for some kind of intervention that also helps those employers and those investors who want to do the right thing, but unfortunately, given the current situation, the money and the opportunities aren't flowing in that direction. So I think public policy interventions are a foundational part of the picture.
All right, we're at the end of the hour. I just want to end with one thought that goes back to something Carrie mentioned at the top of the hour. She mentioned the Knight Foundation study that looked at who's actually doing the investing, and I don't want us to end without reflecting at least 1 minute on that. Again, their studies show less than 2% of the $70 trillion are invested with asset management firms owned by women, owned by underrepresented minorities. Robert Smith has the figure: out of 4,700 banks in the United States, 21 are Black owned and led. $5 billion. That's 1% of 20 trillion. I think for the investment community itself, looking inward, part of the challenge, and again, I'm going back to our friends at CalPERS and CalSTRS, take a look at who's investing your money. What's the nature of those firms themselves? How do we create opportunities, not just at the entry level, but at the top? Look at who's running Fortune 500 companies. Look at who's on the boards of the biggest companies in this country, and look at the investment sector itself. We've got to provide an on-ramp, but we also have to give people a sense there's a place to go and that there are opportunities all the way to the top. So I want to thank all of our panelists. A great discussion. We could literally go on for a long time, but thank Compass as well, Carrie, Sansia, for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion. And I hope there'll be more to come. Thank you all, and thanks for joining us. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.